Okay, so we'll get going. Welcome everybody to the kickoff to our new virtual North American Kant Society meeting. This is going to be going on throughout the fall. Feel free to visit our website. We just recently updated it, and there'll be some other little tweaks here as we go along. So I'm Alex Englert. I'm a postdoc here at Princeton University in Andrew Schignell's Princeton project in philosophy and religion. And I am the coordinator of the virtual NAKS for this academic year. Andrew Schignell is on pilgrimage in Spain and apologizes for not being able to join us today, but he will be back for the remainder of the semester's virtual North American Kant Society events. So today we're having what we refer to as an ideal commentator series. So we're joined by a junior scholar who has produced a paper that's usually won a prize. Today, our guest, who is Andy Werner, won the Marcus Hertz Prize, I think, but then for technical reasons, his paper wasn't officially allowed to be deemed the award, but it counts for us all the same as a winner. And Andy got to choose his ideal commentators. And so Andy, who's at University of Houston, and will be presenting a paper called Cognizing Coexistence, Perceptions and Their Synthetic Unity in Kant's Third Analogy, asked for Steve Engstrom and Sasha Newton. And they both really kindly agreed to join today and be our proverbial sort of sharks in the shark tank that will take bites out of Andy as he's presenting his paper. That said, Sasha, Steve, Andy, and I agreed beforehand that these are going to be polite sharks, and rather than just taking a bite unannounced and interrupting Andy in the middle of his talk, they will raise their hands before taking their bites. And then Andy will, by seeing the raised hands, know that a shark is coming to nibble at his heels. So the idea is that Andy first is going to have a chance to present his paper in full, with Steve and Sasha then respectively making their comments and questions known. At the end of that, they will then pose some sort of bigger picture questions or comments that they may have. And then at the end of the paper, we'll open it up for general Q&A. We are making a recording of this. This is for Andy, but that said, if any of you, for whatever reason, would like a copy of this recording, we're happy to make it available for you. But in order to do so, please then email me, and then I'll share it with you afterwards. Okay, so welcoming here Andy Werner from University of Houston, Steve Engstrom from University of Pittsburgh, and Sasha Newton from UC Riverside. I'll now turn it over to Andy, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, Sasha and Steve, for agreeing to comment on the paper, and to NAKS for letting me do this. So I'm going to share a handout, which is just chunks of the paper. So it's not, it's basically just a small version of the paper, shorter version of the paper. And I have found that the word successive is it's a key word for the third analogy, but it's not a word that you can say very well, or at least I find it quite difficult to say, and I wrote it a lot in this paper, so apologies for stumbling in advance. Okay. Right. So turning from the tree, I see a pond in the distance, and I know that the tree and the pond coexist. That I see the pond after I saw the tree does not make me think that the tree might have ceased to exist. I know that the tree is still there behind me as I look at the pond. How? In the third analogy, Kant explains that I can know that what I successively perceive coexists by combining my perceptions according to the rule that the order in which I perceive them is insignificant to what I perceive. In fact, I first perceived the tree, but I could have perceived the pond first. Where I combine my perceptions in this order and different way, Kant claims I can know, or as he puts it, cognize that the objects I perceive coexist. As Kant puts it, how does one cognize that they exist at one and the same time if the order in the synthesis of the apprehension of this manifold is indifferent? Call this step in Kant's argument order indifference. As many scholars recognize, order indifference is central to Kant's explanation of how I can cognize that different objects coexist. Nevertheless, I will argue that existing interpretations of it fail to capture its role in Kant's argument. By providing a close reading of Kant's account of order indifference, I show that the rule for combining my perceptions already operates in perceiving. Only thus can I cognize that the tree and the pond coexist, despite perceiving them successively. So my reading is, I think, incompatible with the most influential readings of the third analogy that I'm aware of. In this paper, I'm going to focus on the interpretations put forth by Strauss, and I'm going to kind of go over that one pretty quickly, and then by Watkins, to some extent Allison, and I'm going to spend the most amount of time on Lajeunesse' interpretation. I show that their views face significant problems. Either they fail to do justice to the importance of order indifference in Kant's argument, or their interpretation of it leaves Kant's argument hopeless. So now, all of these authors are can kind of like be united in an interpretation of the analogies as a whole that Watkins has aptly termed the problem of time determination. So that all of these authors take this the following view of the analogies as a whole. I first successfully perceive in a way that does not involve an objective time determination. This raises a problem. How can I cognize the time determinations of what I perceive? And on this view, I do so by synthesizing my perceptions in accordance with a rule that does involve an objective time determination. So my focus is on third analogy. Perhaps the problem of time determination and interpretation will work for the first two analogies, but I'm going to try to show that it doesn't work for the third analogy by showing that it can't make sense of the role that order indifference plays in Kant's argument. Now, reading the analogies as responding to the problem of time determination fits in neatly with many of the family of views according to which Kant is a non-conceptualist, by which I mean here, someone who thinks the syntheses of the understanding are performed on acts of sensibility that are independent of these syntheses. By contrast, the reading that I put forward falls in line with a family of views, the family of views called conceptualist, by which I mean here the view that the understanding is already operative in acts of sensibility and acts of perceiving. As my paper proposes it, well, okay, so now I'm going to skip some stuff where I explain why I think my paper is significant. You're all here, so you all are at least willing to listen to me speak for a little bit about it, and I'll make plain the significance that the paper has as I go along. But the order of operations will be in section 1, I clarify Kant's use of the term perception, Wahrnehmung, and situate my account in relation to Clinton Tolley's recent discussion of this topic. In section 2, I show how the interpretations of the third analogy put forth by Strauss and Watkins, Lajeunesse, and Allison fail to make sense of order indifference. And in section 3, I develop my own interpretation of order indifference and the role it plays in Kant's argument. So in the third analogy, Kant claims that I cognize that things exist at one and the same time by combining my successive perceptions of them in an order indifferent way, or order indifference. To cognize that states of distinct substances that I successively perceive coexist, I must synthesize my perceptions according to the rule that I can perceive the states in any order. Relatedly, I'm going to say that a sequence of perceptions is order indifferent if they have been synthesized in this fashion. So I think I'm hopeful that this will meet with widespread assent, because I think that it's an uncontroversial statement of something that Kant says in the third analogy. In what follows, I'm going to try to show that existing interpretations of the role that this claim plays in Kant's argument fail to do it justice. And then that's going to give my other my alternative interpretation. But first, we have to get clear on what Kant means by perception. Sometimes, as Kant uses the term, it picks out something that does not yet involve cognition of any temporal determinations of what one perceives. For instance, when Kant writes that, quote, through the mere perception, the objective relation of the appearances that are succeeding one another remains undetermined. That's from B234. But sometimes it does involve, Kant uses the term in a way that does involve cognition of temporal determinations. For instance, when Kant writes that I, quote, I perceive that appearances succeed one another, i.e. that a state of things exists at one time, the opposite of which existed in the previous state. And that's from B233. So that raises the question, how do we make these passages fit together? How can we square the different things that Kant seems to be saying about perception in passages like these? Okay, so recent work by Clinton Tolley helps answer this question. According to Tolley, Kant's argument in the principles is developmental in that it progresses from intuitions in the axioms to perceptions in the anticipations and to experience in the analogies. He's argued that for Kant, perception in the first instance is consciousness of either a sensation or an intuition. So perceptions, on his view, add consciousness to intuition. In particular, he argues consciousness of the manifold contained in the intuition. Tolley also thinks that perception is not yet cognition of an object or not yet experience in Kant's terms, but merely consciousness of a representation. And that to arrive at cognition of an object, we have to engage in further acts of cognition, further cognitive processing would be one way of describing that. Okay, recognizing with Tolley that the principles developed from perception really from intuition to experience helps us understand Kant's shifting use of the term perception. In the analogies, Kant's explicit topic is experience. That's why they're called the analogies of experience rather than perception. Experience, Kant says, is the determination of an object through a synthesis of perceptions from B219. So Kant's topic in the analogies is the synthesis or a synthesis of perceptions, specifically the synthesis that determines the temporality of the objects perceived. So synthesized, what we perceive is an object and our perception is cognition of it. Kant evidently thinks it appropriate to refer both to what is synthesized and to the synthesis of perceptions as perceptions. So we can, following Kant, call the first sense, the perception, that which gets synthesized, that which involves no objective time determination. We can call that mere perception. So mere perception is that kind of perception that involves no objective time determination. I should use the word kind in quotation marks. We're going to see by the end of this talk that that's not quite the right way to understand the relationship between mere perception and enriched perception. But for right now, I think it'll serve just fine. So mere perception is the kind of perception that involves no objective time determination. And we can add to Kant's terminology and call the synthesis of perceptions, which involves objective time determination, enriched perception. So enriched perceptions make up experience. So using this terminological distinction, we can make sense of Kant's apparently conflicting claims about perception. Mere perception does not determine the objective relation of successively perceived appearances. In the sense of mere perception, I do not perceive changes, nor do I perceive coexistence. But in the sense of enriched perception, I do perceive changes and coexistence. Conforming to the enriched side of Kant's usage, unless otherwise noted, in what follows, when I talk of perception, I'll mean perception as synthesized. I'll mean enriched perception, unless I qualify it with a mean. Okay, so this essay at disambiguation naturally raises the question, how does the synthesis of perceptions relate to perception? Or how does enriched perception relate to mere perception? Is the synthesis of perceptions necessary for mere perception or logically posterior to it? Now, Tolley takes Kant to hold that mere perception is independent of enriched perception, and that mere perception is independent of the activity of the understanding. So on his view, I can merely perceive appearances, and those perceptions will involve no objective time determinations. To arrive at objective time determinations, I must in some way augment my acts of mere perception, perhaps by interpreting the acts of mere perception through an activity of the understanding. Tolley might be right, but the fact that the principles develop does not show that he's right about that. For we must ask how Kant thinks about the development from the axioms to the analogies. One might take Tolley's view, or one might instead argue that Kant builds up an essentially inseparable sequence of capacities or aspects of one kind of rich capacity, showing developmentally that each capacity or aspect of the capacity depends on the one that follows it. On this latter view, to which we shall return in section 3, I never merely perceive anything. Mere perception does not describe an act that I perform, but rather an aspect of an act that I perform, an aspect of the act of enriched perception. Okay, so so far I've just stated that there are two ways of relating mere perceptions to enriched perceptions. And obviously you could take lots of different versions of each of these two ways. Either mere perceptions are independent of enriched perceptions and they're acts that we can engage in, or they're not. Steve.
Just one small point of information. Do you mean to be contrasting these two interpretations by describing a difference in the way they conceive of the capacities as related to one another, or as by way of a difference in how they conceive of the acts of the capacities as related to one another? In other words, it seems like there's a stronger and weaker reading of the difference, and it sounds as though you may be wanting to assert the stronger difference, that you can't even have an act of the capacities that are operative in the axioms of intuition, the syntheses of the axioms of intuition and anticipation of perception, without the acts of the capacities that come to the fore in the analogies. That would be a stronger claim than just saying that you can't have the capacities operative in the mathematical principles without having also the capacity to synthesize according to the principle of the analogies. So does it matter for your purposes, or which difference do you really want to focus on?
Yeah, so I think I was reading it this morning, and I was like, I'm unhappy with this aspect of the paper. So I think in the present draft, it's a little confused. What I want to say is two things. So in the first instance, I want to make a capacity dependence claim. So I want to say the capacities described in the anticipations, I guess, in particular, are dependent upon the capacities described in the third analogy. And that should leave space for an act of mere perception, which I just explicitly, I just said a view on which that's not true. So I think I don't need to say that, and I don't have evidence that would support the claim that there are no acts of mere perception, but I do have evidence that supports the claim that there's no capacity for mere perception. But I also think it's a little, I want to say something a little bit stronger than that, and I'm not sure exactly how to put this, because I think an act of mere perception would be a special sort of thing. Like, it wouldn't be something we normally engage in when we're engaged in receptive uptake of the world. And so I imagine it could happen in some contexts, or and I think that I need a better understanding of what those contexts would be, where we would have that kind of act, as opposed to the more normal, typical, paradigmatic kind of act, which would be an act of enriched perception. And I think, yeah, so capacity dependence is what I think I have an argument for, and then some kind of prioritization of the act of enriched perception over the act of mere perception, but not quite as strong as you could never have an act of mere perception.
Okay.
I'll try to correct. There's stuff I say that will sound stronger, and I'll try to correct it when I say it. And but who knows if I'll succeed at that. Okay, so we've got these two views of the relation between mere perception and enriched perceptions. They depend upon one another, they don't depend upon one another. And then really we've got a matrix of 4 views, because we can talk about the acts depending upon one another, or the capacities depending upon one another, as Steve just made clear. So the readings of the third analogy that I'm going to now consider in section 2, all take it that the synthesis of, so that the enriched perception is logically posterior to mere perception. So I'm going to argue that these interpretations make the argument of the third analogy mysterious. And then I'm going to suggest that we can make the argument of the third analogy unmysterious if we adopt the view that the mere perceptions depend upon the synthetic unity that connects these perceptions with one another. And so it depends upon enriched perceptions. And again, I think that can all be heard in the capacity register. So when I talk of the synthetic unity of enriched perceptions, what I'm really referring to is the capacity for enriched perceptions. And I'm trying to say that mere perceptions depend upon acts of mere perception, and the capacity for mere perception depends upon the capacity for enriched perceptions. Well, that's going to get thorny. All right, section 2, a puzzle about order and difference. So I'm going to consider three different interpretations of order and difference, of the role that order and difference plays in the argument of the third analogy, and pose problems for each of them. So the first one is the criterial theory, most famously associated with Peter Strawson. So here's Strawson, quote, "Our knowledge through perception of the coexistence of things depends upon our implicit recognition of the order and difference of the relevant perceptions. Lack or possession of order and difference on the part of perceptions is, Kant seems to say, our criterion, whether we reflectively realize the fact or not of objective succession or coexistence." So Strawson says, for Kant, my perhaps implicit recognition of the order and difference of my perceptions is the basis upon which I determine that what I perceive coexists. That is, I can know whether my perceptions are order and different in a way that is epistemically prior to my knowing that the objects I perceive in that fashion exist at the same time. The order and difference of my perceptions provides, Strawson thinks, my only available evidence or criterion for determining that the objects I perceive exist at the same time. So let's call Strawson's view a criterial theory. So a criterial theory is the view that Kant invokes our knowledge of the order and difference of a sequence of perceptions as evidence for the coexistence of what we perceive. Now, there are other versions of the criterial theory beyond Strawson. So I'm just going to focus on the general theory, not Strawson's specific version of it, which by his own lights is really quite bad, philosophically speaking. initial objection to the criterial theory, and this is not new to me, lots of people have said this, is that it does not seem like we can know that a given sequence of perceptions is order indifferent without thereby or already knowing that the objects perceived in that sequence coexist. So I think the best possible response to this objection, open to a defender of the criterial theory, is the following. I can know that my perceptions are order indifferent by perceiving the same objects in reverse order. And this knowledge can be my evidence that the objects I perceive coexist. I first perceive the Earth and then the Moon. Then, to determine that my perceptions are order indifferent, I turn back from the Moon to the Earth, etc. When my perceptions are reversible in this way, I use that fact as evidence for thinking that the things I perceive coexist. And that seems like a fact I could know without yet knowing that the objects I perceive coexist. So I'm going to call this reversibility. Some scholars take an order indifference to be reversibility. I'm going to show why I think that's wrong, and it certainly isn't entailed by the Kant statement of it. So this is going to be the second objection to the criterial theory, one that's meant to answer the invocation of reversibility. And this actually comes from Paul Guyer originally, or at least he's the first one that I know of to have made this argument. So the possibility of subsequently perceiving in a different sequence is neither necessary nor sufficient for claiming that the objects perceived in that way coexist. So reversibility is irrelevant to establishing coexistence, but neither necessary nor sufficient. It's not necessary. Perhaps after looking at the Moon, I turn to the Earth, and while looking at the Earth, the Moon is destroyed so that the Moon is not there when I look back. Still, the Earth and the Moon coexisted. Still, it seems like I can cognize that they coexisted. Nor is reversibility sufficient. Perhaps when looking at the Earth, the Moon has not yet come into existence, but the Moon comes to exist by the time I look up. And indeed, one can imagine that they oscillate, such that the emergence of the one causes the destruction of the other, which causes the one to be, which causes the other to be destroyed, which causes the one to emerge, and so on and so forth. So if that were the case, I could turn from one to the other in whatever order and however many times I like, and yet they will never have coexisted. This case is absurd, granted, but nothing in subsequently changing the course of my perceptions is incompatible with this absurdity. We rule it out, but not through reversibility. Okay, so that I can subsequently reverse course in my successive perceptions of distinct things is neither necessary nor sufficient evidence for thinking that those states coexist. By contrast, that I can perceive the objects in any order suffices to show that the states coexist and is necessary for the states to coexist. So it's necessary on the assumptions that the states are perceivable and that their place in time can be determined. And both of these assumptions are things that Kant explicitly states in the analogies, in the framework of the analogies as a whole. So reversibility is neither sufficient nor necessary for cognizing coexistence, while order indifference is. And this should be enough reason to think reversibility is not how we should understand order indifference. Now, this isn't, I think, the death knell of the criterial theory. I think it's possible that a defender of the criterial theory could come up with another basis, apart from cognizing the coexistence of what I perceive, for concluding that I could have perceived the objects in a different order. I've just ruled out reversibility as the basis upon which they can do that. I don't see another base, like nothing comes to my mind as another possible basis that they could then use as the criterion. If there is none, then either Kant's argument in the third analogy does not work, or as I and most other recent interpreters think, that criterial theory must be wrong. Okay, so now the next view. Since order indifference cannot serve as my evidence for cognizing coexistence, and Kant's task in the third analogy is to try to explain how I can cognize coexistence, many scholars conclude that order indifference is inessential to Kant's argument. In this section, I'm going to focus on one version of that view defended by Watkins. I guess I'm not 100% sure that he would accept the characterization that order indifference is inessential, but I'll try to show that that is a conclusion of his view. And if anyone's interested in defending Watkins, we can actually pull up. He does a nice job of schematizing the argument of the third analogy, and I can show you where order indifference disappears and how it actually doesn't play any role, or I think I can. Okay, so it doesn't play any essential role in the argument. It does play a role in the third analogies, namely, according to Watkins, order indifference is meant to help Kant distinguish his position from his predecessors. That is, philosophers before Kant, according to Watkins, thought that we could cognize the time determinations of the objects we perceive by deriving those determinations from features of the subjective sequence of our perceptions. Order indifference forms part of Kant's strategy for helping his readers see that he rejects that view. That's Watkins argues for that. I've got two objections to this. The first, I think, would be decisive, but is in a way a little bit less interesting to me. The first is that I don't think order indifference could be part of a strategy for clarifying that Kant does not mean to infer the objective order from the subjective order. Now, Kant does think what Watkins says he thinks, and he's got an argument that does clarify that. Namely, he makes these two claims. First, he claims that I perceive successfully regardless of the time determinations of the objects I perceive. And second, he claims that I cannot tell the time at which I perceive objects from the content of my perceptions. So from these two claims, it follows that the subjective order of my perceptions does not license an inference to any objective time determination. But I don't need to appeal to order indifference to make that argument. And if one wanted more clarity, if one wanted more emphasis on this distinction, surely Kant's claim, which is also cited by Watkins, that one must, quote, derive the subjective sequence of apprehension from the objective sequence of appearances, end quote, would suffice. That seems like a really good clarification of the thing that Watkins says Kant's trying to clarify. Indeed, order indifference might mislead Kant's readers insofar as it suggests a close connection between the subjective sequence and the objective sequence. Order indifference, remember, describes the subjective succession, and if somehow known, would license the conclusion that the objects I perceived coexistence. Readers like Strawson might be misled by this, seeing it as an expression of a commitment to the traditional idea that one infers the objective order from the subjective order. So not only does it seem to me not to play a role in Kant's attempt to clarify the relation between subjective sequence and objective sequence, but if you were to read it in that light, it would suggest the wrong thing. And I think that's why Strawson goes wrong. So, okay, that's my first objection. But my second objection is, I think, more significant because it makes it plain that Watkins isn't capturing the work that order indifference is meant to do by on Kant's view. So, quite simply, it just doesn't. Watkins' strategy for dealing with order indifference just doesn't fit the text. So here's Kant when he's introducing order indifference. Things are simultaneous insofar as they exist at one and the same time. But how does one cognize that they exist at one and the same time? If the order and the synthesis of the apprehension of this manifold is indifferent, i.e., if it can proceed from A through B, C, D to E, but also conversely from E to A. So in this passage, Kant describes the way I cognize that distinct objects coexist. Since, for example, the Earth and the Moon coexist, I can perceive them in any order. I perceive successively. So in fact, I perceive them in one order. Say first the moon and then first the Earth and then the moon. I cognize that I could have perceived the first the moon and then the Earth by synthesizing my successive perceptions according to the rule that the order in which I perceive those objects has no objective significance. And this is, according to Kant, how I cognize coexistence. So it's not something that's like an inessential clarification. It is the manner in which I cognize coexistence. Watkins sees that for Kant, the order and difference of our perceptions does not serve as a criterion for determining that what I perceive coexists. Kant does not say in this passage or anywhere else that I determine that my perceptions are order indifferent and on that basis determine that the substances I perceive coexist. But Watkins recoils too much from the criterial theory and fails to do justice to Kant's claim that I cognize that the substances I perceive coexist by perceiving them in an order indifferent way. And I think it's pretty reasonable that he does that. You can sort of easily see why he would fall into that error, because it's not at all clear what role order indifference could play in Kant's argument once one sees that it is not our evidence for cognizing coexistence. And so that's the puzzle, how to account for the role order indifference plays in the third analogy. Okay, one final attempt that I'm going to show doesn't work. According to Kant, order indifference articulates how we cognize that the objects we perceive coexist. But order indifference cannot serve as our evidence for cognizing that the objects coexist. Perhaps then, order indifference is a description of the synthesis we effect on our successive perceptions by means of which we cognize that the objects we perceive coexist. On this view, the synthesis is an interpretation of what we merely perceive. So let's call the view the interpreting theory of order indifference. Both Beatrice Longinus and Henry Allison defend versions of this theory. I'm going to be mostly focused on Longinus's because she said more about the third analogy, and because I think her view is actually closer to where I end up. So I'm going to first explain the interpreting theory, and then I'm going to raise an objection to it. So like Watkins and against the criterial theory, Longinus and Allison hold that Kant thinks that I cannot infer the temporal order of the states that I perceive from the temporal order of my successive perceptions. Unlike Watkins, they see order indifference as Kant's explanation of how we determine that things quote from Longinus, determine that things we apprehend only successively are objectively simultaneous. I'm not yet on the handout. Sorry, this was a rushed handout. So I'm not yet there. I'll let you know when I get there. The successive perceptions provide me with data that I interpret as order indifferent, therein determining that the states that I perceive coexist. Oh, I'm there. Okay. Yeah. Successive perceptions provide me with data that I interpret as order indifferent, therein determining that the states that I perceive coexist. Kant's argument in the third analogy is that I can affect that interpretation on a sequence of perceptions only by subjecting them to the rule that the objects I perceive in this manner causally interact with one another. Okay, but how does the interpretation of mere perceptions work? For reasons that I'm going to try to make plain, I'm going to focus on the case for the second analogy. So I'm going to the application of the interpreting theory to the second analogy is much clearer than how it would go for the third analogy. So I'll just explain that before I make my objection. So I successively perceive the same substance in contrary states in the case of the second analogy. As these states are contrary to one another, they cannot coexist in the same substance. As their temporal order must be determinate, I interpret my successive perceptions by synthesizing them according to the rule that their order is objectively significant. For example, I determine that the stone goes from a state of being cold to a state of being warm. That is objectively different from the interpretation according to which the stone goes from a state of being warm to a state of being cold. The argument of the second analogy is then meant to show that I affect this interpretation of what I merely perceive through applying the rule that the change in what I perceive happens in accordance with the law of cause and effect. And I can do this only by determining the transition to be the result of some cause. So I interpret the stone as changing from being cold to being warm by cognizing that some cause brought about that change rather than the opposite change. Okay, so that's my explanation of the interpreting theory. I think it's got a great deal of plausibility, and it seems to do justice to what Kant says about the synthesis of our perceptions in the second analogy, and it avoids the philosophical and exegetical troubles with the criterial theory. The theory founders, however, on the third analogy's appeal to order indifference. Okay, so this is now the objection. To make the view work for the third analogy, we must find some data that we can tell involves or suggests the coexistence of states of distinct substances. But what is the data? If I perceive first the moon and then the earth, it might be plausible to suppose that I can determine on the basis of mere perception that I am perceiving two distinct substances. I thus might rule out that I am perceiving a change or contrary states of the same substance. But none of this tells me anything at all about the coexistence or succession of the perceived states of the substances that I am merely perceiving. It does not make determining them to coexist any more or less reasonable than determining that they do not coexist. So why does the view founder on the third analogy but seem to work okay on the second analogy? The relevant difference is that in the third analogy, the states that we perceive successively are states of distinct substances, whereas the second analogy concerns states of the same substance. The extra unity provided by the sameness of the substance in the second analogy makes the interpreting theory more plausible, as it provides the basis for placing contrary states into distinct times. But there is no such substantial unity to work with in the third analogy. The state of one substance might well have changed just before we turn to perceive it, or it might not have changed, and nothing in the perceived content of the states suggests the one interpretation or the other. On the interpreting theory, I contend it is obscure what would support interpreting the states we perceive in one way rather than the other. Okay, so I think this is probably not in the spirit of a Shark Tank, but I'm going to go ahead and a couple of comments about what I say in this section about Longines's view. I think my view is pretty close to Longines's view, and I'm not totally sure that I'm getting her view right in my objection to what she says. I have there's some like reasons I'm kind of in the background that lead me to interpret her in the way that I'm saying in this section, which we can talk about in the Q&A. But the biggest thing is that when she talks about order indifference and order invariance, she very frequently talks about it as though it were reversibility. So she very frequently talks about turning from one thing to another and then back. And that is meant to be the kind of evidence that we have for interpreting what we see as either successive or coexisting. And I don't think that can work. I don't think if you have the view that order indifference is reversibility, you can, well, one thing I think you're forced to say that what we're doing is we've got some evidence from mere perception, and then we're interpreting that evidence in light of a rule that we then apply. So I think you're forced to say mere perceptions are independent of enriched perceptions. But for the other thing, I think Paul Geyer's objection to reversibility is just a really good one, and that reversibility cannot be the same thing as order indifference, and it can't play a role in Kant's argument. Yeah, there we go. All right, now for my, yeah.
So could I just ask a question at this point for further clarification as to how your criticism of the interpretation or interpretive approach runs? I take it you're finding that alternative reading plausible for the case of the first two analogies. You're not raising any objections to it in those applications anyway. But when it comes to the third analogy, you're seeing a problem, which is a dearth of data that could support the experience of simultaneity. So I wanted to ask what exactly the difference is between the data available on this interpretation in the in connection with the second analogy and experience of succession and ordered succession, and the data available in the case of experience of simultaneity. I wasn't seeing myself a pronounced difference in the data. Now, I'm not sure what you mean by data, but I'm starting with the thought that what Kant's concerned with is just the successive character of the perceptions as I encounter them in experience. And it seems to me that the claim that the appearances are objectively ordered successively in time goes beyond the data in just as much as the claim that they are simultaneous goes beyond the data. And so if we understand data in this way, and so it's not clear to me that the interpreting theory is coming across a stumbling block when it reaches the third analogy. I mean, it looks as though, and I'm thinking now of what Kant himself will say, that we sort of find or encounter perceptions ordered successively. That's just true across the board. And in the case of experience of succession among the objective succession among the appearances, we go beyond that mere succession in the apprehension, which he says is merely contingent, and make a kind of a judgment or a representation which you might say grounds a certain necessity in the order. So there's a kind of step from mere contingent ordering that's successive to an understanding of that order as necessary on account of its reflecting something in the object. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the same situation we find in the case of the third analogy as well. We go beyond the mere contingent successive ordering of perceptions to a thought that this order is no more than contingent. So we exclude what we introduced in the case of the reasoning in the second analogy, or the experience in the second analogy. We don't say that the ordering has a necessity grounded in the object. We say it doesn't. And so we're kind of taking a modal step. In both cases, it goes beyond the mere actual succession of perceptions in inner sense, so to speak, or in consciousness. So I'm not seeing that the third analogy, that this interpretive theory need be in any worse shape vis-a-vis the third analogy than it is in vis-a-vis the second.
Yeah. So I don't think it would be I don't think it's plausible to say Kant has an interpreting theory in the first two analogies. The interpreting theory is true for the first two analogies, but not for the third. I don't think that would be a plausible reading of the text as a whole. And I don't. And I agree with you that in the second and the third analogy, and in the first analogy, we have a step. We have kind of a modal step that isn't licensed by the successive character of our perception. Isn't licensed merely by the successive character of our perceptions. But I was thinking, it seems like people who are fans of the interpreting theory are satisfied with their way of doing. A way of explaining that step as it applies to the first and the second analogy, so that they think that they can get to experience with respect to those two analogies on the basis of the data involved, and then like make it okay for there to be an injection of necessity on top of that. I think, at least in the case of the second analogy, I'm not sympathetic to this. Like, I don't think the strategy is going to work, but I think I can see why they might think it works for the second analogy, because the states perceived successively are contrary to one another. So they cannot coexist so long as we assume them to be states of the same object. And I can rule that out. I can arrive at that necessity just by kind of the law of non-contradiction. I don't need any, I don't need the peculiar kind of necessity characteristic of the understanding of synthetic unity. And so I'm not sure that this is right, but my hypothesis is that that is doing a lot of work in making people who defend the interpreting theory okay with what they have to say about the second analogy, that of course the stone is not both cold and warm at the same time. It's got to be one or the other. It's got to be one before the other. And then we need to figure out which it is. And so let's go look for stuff around it. And that will, suggest one over the other, and then we inject necessity on the basis of whatever the story is for that. And so I don't think that story is going to work, but I think even if you thought the story was going to work, you couldn't make sense of it for the case of the third analogy, because the data, there's just like, I turn to from the Earth to the moon, there's no relation between the states that suggests that they could be changing independently of one another. They might not be changing independently of one another. There's no that the role that contrariety plays in the interpreting theory's understanding of the second analogy, there's nothing like that in the third analogy. And so I was thinking, yeah.
So the contrariety is only relevant to the first analogy. Right, that contrariety just entails that there's got to be some ordering or other. The second analogy is concerned with which ordering, which comes first, which comes after. And so there's a further, I mean, you're quite right. There's something further that we're relying upon in taking the step to thinking of the one appearance as before the other. But frankly, I'm not myself seeing in Kant's own discussion much interest in that question. What is the, what in virtue of what do we rely on in making that determination of order? I think both the second and the third analogy, the exposition seems to leaves me with the impression that this is not a question that Kant is concerning himself with, and fretting over it seems to be taking us outside of the line of thinking that he's following.
I agree with that. I just meant to be characterizing the view that I'm opposing and that I think you're opposing too, and sort of trying to work out how they're thinking about the topic of the second analogy and the first analogy. And so I agree that, but I agree completely with what you've said. And I think once you leave that view behind and accept that Kant just sort of takes that for granted, that I know the order through that he assumes that we have that. then there won't be this distinction between the second and the third analogy. But there also, you also wouldn't be offering an interpretive theory at that point, I think. At least on my understanding.
It's not in quite the shape that it has here. Yeah.
Sasha.
Just wondering, so do you read the interpretive theory as saying that the interpretation we give of the perceptions, for instance, as objectively successive or as objectively coexisting, is justified, or we make that interpretation on the basis of the materials or the data of experience? Is that how you read them?
So it's not like it's not justified in the sense of an inference. So it does involve an injection of necessity that's not there in mere perception. But I take it that which injection we make has to be guided by what's there in mere perception. So whether we interpret it in accordance with the second analogy or the third analogy is the only way we could do that in a guided fashion is if there's something in the mere perception that guides.
So on these views, the source of the objective validity of my judgment that, for instance, two things are coexisting, the source of that objective validity, the source of the objectivity of my judgment lies in the data, the materials of experience, and not in the form of experience as an act of the understanding.
Well, so that I think, I mean, obviously it depends a little bit on what objective is taken, but I think that Langeness wants to say it lies in the understanding, the forms of the understanding. So the objectivity comes from the understanding, not from mere perception. But mere perception is still that which is being interpreted, and so it's got to provide, matter that's conducive to the. I mean, if we want to speak like I like speaking like this, matter that's conducive to the form supplied by the understanding, but the problem I have with Langeness's view is that it doesn't, like, the way she's understanding the matter, it would make it impossible to supply the right form, or there'd be no right or wrong form with respect to determining the coexistence or lack thereof of distinct states of distinct substances. Did that?
So you want to enrich the matter so that it can do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So that was the critical portion of the paper, and now the positive portion of the paper. Okay. So I'm not yet on the handout. So far, we've considered three views of the role of order and difference in the third analogy. One view fails to acknowledge Kant's claim that order and difference is the way in which we cognize that things coexist with one another. The other two views attempt to explain the claim, but fail in the attempt. The criterial theory fails because it holds that Kant invokes order and difference as our criterion for determining whether things coexist. And the interpreting theory fails because it holds that order and difference is the act by which we interpret the sequence of perceptions and thereby determine that the objects perceived coexist. The philosophical problem with the latter two interpretations is at root the same. Now the handout. The data available prior to cognizing coexistence is insufficient to justify the claim or interpretation that what we perceive coexists. For the criterial theory, order and difference is meant to serve as evidence by means of which we cognize that things coexist. But we cannot use order and difference as evidence for the claim that things coexist, because we can only cognize that our perceptions are order and different if we already know that the things we perceive coexist. For the interpreting theory, order and difference is meant to be our interpretation of the data available to us from mere perception, but we cannot justify combining our perceptions in an order and different way rather than some other way, and therein interpret what we perceive to coexist on the basis of what is made available by mere perception. How might we avoid the problem that plagues both the criterial and interpreting theories? So the solution, I suggest, is simple, though it has far-reaching consequences. In the B edition version of the principle of the third analogy, Kant says that, quote, substances can be perceived in space as simultaneous, B256, I added a word there, but According to the interpretations we have considered so far, Kant means that substances can be perceived as simultaneous only after the understanding acts on the mere perceptions of what is in space. These views fail. Mere perceptions do not provide enough for the understanding to produce the enriched perception of coexistence rather than the enriched perception of objective succession. If that's right, the solution must be that Kant thinks that we can cognize coexistence in any act of perception, or put differently, that every act of perception is an act of enriched rather than mere perception. And okay, so now I need to, in light of Steve's first question, what I really mean to say is that originally the act of perception is an act of enriched perception. Maybe we can do these derivative, less fundamental things of mere perceptions, but they're not the data by which we arrive at enriched perceptions. They're not the primary case of perception. And the capacities involved in mere perception depend upon the capacities involved in enriched perception. Okay, so some clarifications. First clarification, both the criterial and interpreting theories hold that for Kant, the capacity to merely perceive is separable from the capacity to perceive in an enriched sense, such that we arrive at the second capacity or acts of the second capacity only through acts of the understanding on the results of the first capacity. I must determine that the things I perceive coexist on the basis of first perceiving them in a way that involves no objective time determination. In the face of the problem with this view, the natural suggestion is that there is no initial stage prior to the temporal determination of coexistence. And that's what I mean when I say that every act of perception is an act of enriched rather than mere perception. Again, now I need to qualify that a bit. Maybe there are acts of mere perception, but they're going to be derivative. They're not going to be the basic case. So as an example of my view, on the view I'm putting forward, when I perceive the Earth before perceiving the moon, I am cognizant that the Earth exists at a time at which other things like the moon might exist. In first perceiving the Earth, I do not thereby know what other things coexist with it, but I can know on the basis of what I go on to perceive what coexists with it. According to Kant, that is possible only if in perceiving the Earth, I am cognizant that I might have perceived whatever else exists at the time at which I perceive the Earth, had I been positioned differently, for instance. In other words, in perceiving the Earth, I'm in a position to judge that it coexists with an indefinite number of other things. And the capacity I exercise in perceiving the Earth is a capacity to cognize what other things coexist with the Earth. Kant's argument in the third analogy, in the rest of the third analogy, is meant to show that the capacity to perceive is a capacity to cognize coexistence only if things that coexist causally interact with one another. But as it were, his starting point is this idea that I can, in perceiving the Earth, I'm already exercising the capacity to determine that things coexist with one another, or to cognize coexistence. Okay, so two more clarifications. Note that I mean perceiving coexistence to imply knowingly perceiving coexistence. All agree that Kant is talking about how I cognize that things coexist on the basis of perception. To invoke a kind of perception that involves perceiving coexistence unknowingly would just re-raise the problem that besets the criterial and interpreting theories. On the basis of what do I come to know that the things I perceive unknowingly in a way in which involves coexistence, but unknowingly, how do I transition from that to a state of knowing perception? That's just the same question. And so this just a clarification of how I'm using the idea of perceiving coexistence here. I mean it in the sense that I am knowingly perceiving coexistence. And then what does that mean? So third clarification, to say that I knowingly perceive coexistence means that perceiving puts me in the position to judge that states of distinct substances coexist. This does not mean that perceptions are judgments, or even that perceiving involves judging. The way the categories inform perception does not turn perception into a judgment. I am not in knowingly perceiving the moon and the Earth as coexisting, exercising the capacity to judge, since I am not judging that they coexist. Rather, I'm exercising the capacity to perceive, a capacity that puts me in the position to make judgments about the moon and the sun that involve the implicit or explicit recognition that they coexist. And for this way of clarifying the idea of knowingly perceiving, I am indebted to Thomas Land, his wonderful work. Okay, so my solution to the puzzle about ordinate difference involves attributing a version of what is typically called conceptualism to Kant. Conceptualism, as applied to Kant, is roughly the view that the understanding operates in and not just on sensibility. I'll follow Jim Conant in calling the view the transformative conception of human-mindedness, with the idea being that the operation of the understanding in sensibility transforms the very nature of sensibility so that it is a distinctively rational form of sensibility. The term transformative better highlights the philosophical aspirations of the view as I understand it. The idea is not to reduce sensibility to the understanding or intuitions to concepts, but to articulate some kind of inseparable unity of the two. And note that that was all put in terms of capacities. So Our capacity to merely perceive once fully in view is the capacity to perceive coexistence because it already involves the rule supplied by the understanding to combine successive perceptions of coexisting things in an order in a different way. So it may surprise people that I'm grouping Longinus with the non-conceptualists. Certainly for the purposes of many discussions, she's not. Most significantly, she defends the claim that perceptions are as such informed by the relational categories of the analogies, and so would deny the non-conceptualist claim that I can perceive in a way that is independent of the understanding. But she thinks that there are acts of mere perception and denies that mere perception puts me in a position to judge that the objects I perceive fall under any of the relational categories just by itself. For that judgment, I must first interpret what I perceive through an action of the understanding on mere perception. As I argued in section 2.3, it's unclear how we can become cognizant of the coexistence of what we perceive if we proceed in this way. Hence, for the purposes of solving the puzzle about order and difference, Longinus belongs with the non-conceptualists, according to whom we initially perceive things without cognizing whether they coexist. Hopefully, you can show me that I'm wrong about Longinus on this front, but that's how it seems to me anyway. Yeah, a couple of points about the force of the conclusion. I don't think arguments about the third analogy in particular are going to convince committed non-conceptualists that they should give up their non-conceptualism about Kant. But I do think that I've shown, or anyway, I hope I've shown that non-conceptualists need a better interpretation of the third analogy than they currently have, because the existing ones don't do the trick. They may do the trick from the non-conceptualist perspective for the first two analogies, but I don't think that they do the trick for the third analogy. I also think it's significant to just work out in detail how the conceptualist or the transformative view of Kant works for the third analogy. That's not something that I've seen done other than with Longinus, and I've shown why I don't think her way of doing it can work. Finally, I think this will prepare the way for an interpretation of the argument of the third analogy. I've just been interpreting like the opening paragraph of the third analogy, really, which I think of as Kant's starting point. We knowingly perceive coexisting things. How is that possible? And then he gives an argument that can only be possible if the substances that we perceive to coexist are in interaction with one another. I haven't actually given that argument. But without seeing the starting point correctly, I don't think you can understand the argument well. And so hopefully this is preparatory to a better interpretation of the third analogy. Thank you.
Great. Before we conclude and thank Andy, we'll let the sharks have their two last bites here. So Steve and Sasha, if you'd like to end with some sort of comment or bigger picture question, feel free to do that now. And then once Andy has answered both of those, we'll applaud, thank him, and then I'll let all the other sharks eat him.
You want to go first, Sasha?
Whatever. Okay. Just briefly, I have two small points. So the first is that you suggested that you want to enrich perception so that it can constrain interpretations of perceptions and enable me to determine the perceived things as coexisting. But in a way, I think that just is what Longinus is doing by putting the schemata for the categories inside of perception and showing how perception is transformed by the schemata of the categories. So that's why I was a bit confused about how your view differs from hers. And my other question is more broad. It's related to Steve's first question. One thing that I think your reading emphasizes, I think this is correct, is that the development of Kant's argument through the axioms, anticipations, and analogies is the development or unfolding of a single cognitive capacity and not a stacking of different capacities on top of one another corresponding to different acts, as on what you call the additive view. But you seem, in the paper, you seem to think that because it's one capacity, therefore there must be a single activity, the activity of knowing or enriched perception, experience, and then these different sections of the principles chapter correspond to different aspects of that single activity. And I think that might be right, but I'm wondering whether that's I mean, that there is a single activity that incorporates all of them. But I'm wondering whether you agree that that's compatible with an epigenetic reading of the principles, according to which there's an unfolding of the capacity in different acts or activities, intuiting, perceiving, experiencing, where the prior acts get incorporated into and then further determined or transformed at the later stages. So perception gets transformed by experience. But that would still be compatible with saying you can have perceiving without experiencing, you can have intuiting without perceiving. So there's my.
I think, yeah, so I didn't want to say that the enriched perceptions constrain interpretation. The fit is much tighter on the view that I want to espouse. So constraining interpretation suggests that there's like an interpreting activity and it's like could go any which way, and then it gets locked down by some data or something like that. And I was thinking, and that is, so I think that is how or anyway, that's how I understand Longinus's view, and it sounds like that's how you understand her view too. I was thinking that the understanding is already active, it's already formed the perceptions, and so there's no data that then gets interpreted on the view that I meant to espouse.
That's what I thought her view is, because the schemata are at work. The schemata of the categories are at work even prior to judgment in perceivings on her view. Yeah, so, but I mean, she says some things that make me think the way she understands that isn't what I want. So I mentioned the biggest thing, which is that she understands order and difference in terms of reversibility, at least very frequently. And so she's got this view on which you do a bunch of checking, and the checking leads you to the checking as guided by the kenosis to judge leads you to make one assessment over another assessment. But also she thinks that the right logical function for the third analogy is hypothetical judgment, reciprocal hypothetical judgments, as opposed to disjunctive judgments. And that fits very neatly with the view I just said, which is you go from one to another and back. But it's not, it's disjunctive judgment. And I think that fits more neatly with the idea that what we're doing is, I am having an active perception. I perceive one thing, and that's a determination of the whole of spatial objects. And then I can know that that's a member of this whole of spatial objects, and I can perceive another thing. And then another, I mean, I don't know how much to hold her to this way of talking. Sebastian Rudel in his book, I think, is a little unkind to her about this, but there are places where she says things like, we don't perceive temporal determinations. It's just a deception. It's just how it looks to the naive consciousness that we perceive changes. And we need to break that deception in order to really get in picture what's going on. So that suggests to me, if maybe the dialectical context is such that she doesn't mean it in this way, but that suggests to me that what we need to do is we need to break up our everyday stuff into an act of mere perception and then something on top of it, and another thing. All of that's consistent with saying that there's a way in which the understanding is present in perception, but not a way that already involves knowingly perceiving coexistence. And that's sort of how I understand the way in which the categories are present in perception for her. But yeah, I admit I do not feel like I have a complete understanding of her view. And then and then towards the second point. Nothing that I say in the paper rules out the epigenetic account that you were offering.
I mean, so no argument I make in the paper, various formulations I have in the paper rule it out by fiat, but not in a reasoned fashion. I guess I don't have the epigenetic view. I don't have the epigenetic view. So like Hegel, I think, has what you're describing as the epigenetic view in, say, the Encyclopedia Philosophy of Spirit. He will on and on talk about the way in which sensations are changed, and then intuitions are changed, and then imagination or representation is changed. And so he'll talk about the ways in which the cognitive acts transform the acts at the lower level. I don't see that language in Kant. That's not a great argument that it's not. Maybe I'm missing it, or maybe it's there, but he wasn't emphasizing it. Certainly, I would be philosophically open to the idea that it's there, but it is presently not how I read the development of the principles, because everything is put in terms of experience. Like from the start, it's put in terms of experience, and then it just seems clear that he's like saying everything he's saying to get there. So so at the very least, it doesn't seem central to his project to account for the individual acts, if there are. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
Great, Steve.
You're muted, Steve.
Thank you. I think my question is much along the lines of Sasha's line of questioning. I'd like to invite you to just continue to say more about how you see your proposed interpretation, how you understand it, and how you see it as a version of conceptualism, as you are putting it here, the view that the understanding operates in and not just on sensibility. That language invites the thought that the perceptions that are available for the synthesizing that goes on in the in experience described in the three analogies, that those perceptions, according to the other views, or some of them anyway, are mere deliverances of sensibility. But it doesn't seem as though that's the way Kant is thinking of them, and I would presume that the interpreters you're opposing wouldn't be committed to, or wouldn't need to be committed to, thinking of these as deliverances of sensibility. So I wanted to hear a little more about on that score. I mean, the axioms of intuition, the anticipations of perception are offered as the proofs that are offered as proofs of principles that are meant to be constitutive of perception. One in respect of its form, the other in respect of its matter. And so it seems to be built into that account of perception that comes out of the mathematical principles, that it's that the perceptions are informed by the understanding. Right? There's a kind of a conceptually informed synthesis of aggregation and of coalition that enter into the constitution of these perceptions. So these are nothing like mere raw bits of sensibility that are being contemplated, in some temporal order. They have substantial intellectual form already. And now we're going to take up the question of how they stand vis-a-vis one another, right? The synthesis in the analogies is one of connecting these perceptions with one another in the way that constitutes experience of objects. I'm having a little trouble seeing why someone couldn't grant endorse your conceptualism if that just means that we're not thinking of the understanding as operating on bits of raw sensibility, and still want to maintain that these perceptions that are described as successive in consciousness have a kind of independence from the synthesis that is exercised upon them. You don't talk to, I don't think you really go into the argument that Kant offers at the head of the analogies, right? Before the first, second, and third analogies, he gives a kind of a generic argument, and the principle is that experience consists in a determination of an object through perceptions, and there's a proof of this. And if you look at the proof, it really provides a kind of an analysis of experience. And in that argument, we see Kant speaking of perceptions occur at two moments. There's an initial account of perceptions as coming together in experience merely accidentally. Zufälligerweise, I think he says, merely accidentally. And by the end of the paragraph, he's describing these perceptions, or the perceptions, as being related to one another or connected necessarily. So it looks as though we have different levels of analysis here. On one level, the order among perceptions is merely contingent. On the other, there's a necessary connection. And we can presume that the contingent ordering is nevertheless temporal, right? It's so it's probably going to involve a synthesis of aggregation or something like that, at least. But the fact that they're being described in these two different relations suggests that there is a kind of difference in order. The connecting presupposes the aggregating, but the aggregating doesn't presuppose the connecting. So I was helped by your saying you don't want to see that the acts are the same, but it does seem to me to be important that there be this space for a kind of understanding of perceptions as merely contingently related to one another. I liked what you were saying in response to my initial question. And so perhaps what you had to say then will be relevant here, but I just wanted to kind of press this clear and apparent intent on Kant's part to mark a difference between two different respects or ways in which perceptions can be thought of as being ordered. And the one must precede the other, it seems, just conceptually, logically. So I'll stop with that.
Can you why must, so that was helpful. I think that was pointing me in the direction of the epigenetic evidence for the epigenetic kind of view that there's an overall fundamental act, but the derivative or subsidiary or component capacities or that he goes through in the principles are each have their own acts. So I guess, yeah, I mean, the way I see the opening of the analogies, that argument is so far, you know, basically, so far as what we've said is enough to give rise to an accidental coming together of perceptions, but that's not, you know, that's not enough. That's not what we have. So we have a necessary coming together.
In experience.
Experience. Let me now describe that. And then I don't really think that in the way I have read that, it didn't to me imply that we first have an accidental coming together and then we supply a necessary order to that which is accidentally put together. It struck me more as, yeah, so far we haven't finished our description of the capacity that we're talking about because we just got this accidental unity, but we know from all the way back in the aesthetic even, we need a necessary unity of these things. And so we've got further steps to do. I guess and then maybe it would be helpful to me to think more about what it would, I don't know exactly how to put this, but what it would be like to undergo or undertake or have, I would say experience, but I don't mean that, the sequencing of perceptions that was accidental. So, I mean, as long as having that presupposes having, presupposes being able to inject order, necessary unity into it, then the bulk, like the main thing that I'm trying to argue for in the paper at that generic level is good. And then obviously the details for the third analogy need to be worked out. But and then, but I'm not sure what it would be like to have a set of perceptions that were like what that,
I mean, there are cases where one's not sure what to say. I mean, the example of the Earth and the Moon might lead us to think of other astronomical phenomena where we perceive one object, then we perceive another, and we're not sure about temporal order. We're sure about the temporal order of our perceptions, but we're not sure about how it stands with the objects, the appearances themselves. We do very often find ourselves at a point where we're not sure what to, I'm going to say judge here, what we're experiencing, or what the step is to take to have an experience of an objective order. So I think that we're not really hampered, or the cases where we are confident of the one so-called subjective ordering, but we're not yet ready to take a step to the experience to claim, make a claim about an objective ordering are common enough.
I see. Yeah. So if that's all you mean, then yes, but I'm completely on board with that happening. But I guess I think that happens against the backdrop not only of the capacity to ascribe necessary to experience necessary unity, necessary order, but against actual necessary order. So I don't think you could have, what I was envisioning with this epigenetic talk was like, we have a bunch of accidentally coming together perceptions with no experience yet, and then we arrive at experience. And I guess I don't see space for. I'm not sure what that would look like. But if all you mean is
on a global scale,
yeah.
all we engage in were judgments of perception according to the Prolegomena account. That doesn't seem to be something Kant is concerning himself with here. I agree with that.
Okay. Then yes. So then I just want to accept what you're saying then about the possibility of acts of mere perception. Yeah.
Right.
And then I'm not sure about so the first thing you were saying was that the transformative view as I articulated was something that
Andy, sorry, do you mind if we put it? Let's stop. The person being eaten by the shark accepted the sharks gnawing at him, and I just really want to make sure that I allow enough time for other people to sort of jump in here and provide their 2 cents, which I'm sure will also probably come back to the same theme and allow us to sort of dig deeper there. So apologies for interrupting, but I just want to make sure that we have the last 40 minutes for open Q&A. So at this point, everybody join me virtually thanking Andy for a wonderful paper and our ideal commentators.